Hello, my name is Amy, and I am really excited to be talking to you today about one of my favorite wine regions in the world. In fact, wine growing countries in the world. It's been my home for the last 3 years. It has one of the most interesting wine histories that I've come across, and also one of the most tumultuous histories I've come across as well, for a wine producing region. I am, of course, talking about Lebanon. Now, you might be thinking, Lebanon, wine? But actually, Lebanon has one of the oldest wine growing traditions in the world, if not the actual oldest. It dates back about 7,000 years ago. So this is way before anything was happening in France or Italy or Greece. It was said to have been started by the Phoenicians, who were the people of Lebanon at the time, and they were great, not only great farmers and grape growers, they were also great commerciants, very good business people as well. They began growing wine about 7,000 years ago when they realized they had something really, really good. About 3,000 years later, they began exporting it through the port of Byblos, which is just above Beirut in Lebanon. They call their product Bibline, and they used to put the wine in huge amphora pots, and they would seal it with local olive oil and cedar resin so that no air or very little air could get in, and they would ship it off to Egypt and Italy and Spain and France. And they are thought to be the first wine merchants in the world. Now, Lebanon became known for its wine not only from the people who were living in the area, was also mentioned numerous times in the Bible. And of course, miracles were actually performed with wine in the Bible. That very famous miracle in the south of Lebanon, where Jesus turned water into wine. The wines of Lebanon are also mentioned in Psalms and have been compared for years gone by as some of the best wines available in the world. So why don't we talk more about Lebanon's wines? Unfortunately, way back then, Lebanon was already suffering at the hands of neighbours and invasions. And in 1517, the Ottoman Empire that was making its way across Europe at the time also made it into Lebanon. Now, the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim rule that at the time condemned the production of wine for commercial purposes. However, the priests and monks were allowed to continue producing wine for sacred purposes, for communion wine, and of course people still produced grapes to eat, or raisins as well. In fact, talking about monks and priests, it was actually Jesuit priests who started what was Lebanon's first commercial winery back in, I'm talking about a winery in an area called the Bekaa Valley, and it was Chateau, started by Jesuit monks in 1857. But even way before then, there is also something else absolutely extraordinary in Lebanon, and anyone who is a fan of ruins or visiting ruins will love this, and that is of course in the area of Baalbek, and we have the Temple of Bacchus. Now, Baalbek is thought to date back to about 150 AD, and it is incredibly beautiful, a set of ruins and temples with engravings, and one of those temples, the Temple of Bacchus, is dedicated to the god of wine, and that is because of the area in which it is an incredibly good area for growing wine, but I will come on to that in a little bit when I speak about the regions of Lebanon. So we've learnt that the Jesuit priests were the first to bring their vines over from Northern Africa, and they were Sanso vines actually, and plant them and produce what is thought to be the first commercial winery in Lebanon back in 1857. And at the same time, around 1850s, there was this terrible plague that was spreading like wildfire across Europe and basically getting rid of most of the vines. And this was called Phylloxera. France suffered massively due to Phylloxera and lost about 90% of its vineyards, which coincided very nicely when at the end of the Ottoman Empire, there was actually a French mandate in Lebanon from about 1917. So when the French arrived in Lebanon and realized that Lebanon was not only rife with grapes, but rife with really, really good wine, they begged them to start producing more and more, which of course Lebanon did very, very happily. A lot of the wineries that began producing in those times were using French grapes. And producing somewhat for the French market, as well as their own domestic market, because that is where they were earning most of their income from. And they did so very happily until 1975. Now, in 1975, the second disaster to hit Lebanon struck in the form of a civil war. Wine was still being produced, and in fact, some wineries became incredibly famous for being able to export. There was one winery in particular, which was Chateau Musar, who really made his name in the 1980s when he was able to get his wine from Lebanon to the UK, actually to a wine fair, despite there being air raids and bombings in the area where the wines are grown. During that time, there was about 5 main wineries operating. Most of them were in this area called the Bekaa Valley. Now, the war ended in 1990. Like any country that has been struck by war, it was devastated. But people began to realize that actually investing in their own land would actually allow them to have more control over their economy, and more wineries began to pop up. So from the 5 that were existing in 1975, in the next couple of decades, there was about 20 or so to pop up. I think nowadays in Lebanon, there are about 60 operating wineries. The market internally, at least, does tend to be dominated by these 5 big ones. But there are so many other wineries, and I'm going to talk to you about where they are now, producing incredible wines. Lebanon as a country, what does it look like? It's small. Lebanon measures about 150 kilometers from north to south by about 65 kilometers from east to west. It has a mountain range running through it, so the spine of Lebanon, we can call it, which is Mont Liban, or Mount Lebanon. On the east side, there is another range called the Anti-Lebanon range, and then nestled between these 2 ranges is this very fertile plain called the Bekaa Valley. This is where the majority of grapes are grown, and because it has such great growing conditions. The lowest part of the Bekaa Valley, and it's probably fairer to call it a plain rather than a valley, is about 900 meters high. So really able to make use of some good altitude there. The natural snowmelt from the surrounding mountains help to irrigate the vines. There's also a large lake in the Bekaa. It can get very dry. It seems to have a bit of everything, and it's perfect for growing grapes. So there are a number of wineries that have existed there or have started to pop up there in different parts of the Bekaa Valley. Now, I mentioned Mount Lebanon as well. This tends to be in the area sort of just north of Beirut. Again, as the name would suggest, it's a mountainous region, and the wineries that choose to grow there also are able to play around a little bit with altitude and produce very, very fresh wines, because of course Lebanon is an incredibly warm country. It's a lot lower than the other European countries that are producing wine. But where they are unable to win in terms of latitude, they definitely make up for it in terms of altitude and where they are planting their grapes. Now, if you were to go north of Beirut, by about probably 30 kilometers, you reach a seaside town called Batroun, and behind Batroun you have the Batroun mountain range as well. So again, another mountain. And here you will find other wineries that have popped up. They tend to be much smaller, boutique wineries with the vineyards surrounded by olive groves, and there's cedar trees, and you've got the influence from the sea breeze. And it's absolutely stunning. And then at the bottom of Lebanon, we have what we call South Lebanon. And there we have another region. Again, really, really hard conditions there. Very, very tough because it's very kind of rocky, very steep hills. But there is one winery at least there that is producing wine and has been for the last 20 years or so. Now, I mentioned a lot of wineries used French grapes, of course. And there are grapes like Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon that will grow pretty much all over the world. But what's really interesting about Lebanon as well is the fact that it has its own native grapes too. So white wine grapes like Obeide or Merwah, red grapes like Sabachie are all gradually being introduced to the Lebanese wine scene, as well as new techniques of making wine, more modern techniques. There is a winery next to a lake in the West Bekaa Valley, it's called La Turba, and they also use grapes like Fiano, Sangiovese, Albarino, and they've actually got the first Lebanese sparkling wine as part of their portfolio. Very, very elegant wines, really, really nice quality. If you go to the West Bekaa, just out from the lake, there's a tiny little winery called Terjois. These guys specialize in high altitude wines, particularly using the Sanso grape, which is said to best express Lebanese terroir. Although I've mentioned these regions, these wine regions, there is no specific classification system in Lebanon. So it's not like going to France or Spain where you'll find Denominación de Orígenes or AOCs, appellations. You can roughly classify the wineries from where they are, whether it's Bekaa, Mont-Liban, Batroun Mountains, but there is no specific rules for that at the moment. In the main stead of the Bekaa Valley is where you'll find these big wineries like Chateau Musar, Chateau Freya, Chateau Ksara, Messiah as well. These are all really, really good wines, really, really nice examples of Lebanese wines, just much bigger production than some of the others I've mentioned. And if you head to the North Bekaa, this is where these beautiful ruins of Baalbek, you've got a very interesting area called Deir Al-Ahmar. And this, for anyone in Lebanon, is usually synonymous with hashish or the production of marijuana, which of course is illegal, but unfortunately has been the only method of many local farmers being able to survive. So what one winery did was produce or form a co-op where they actually pulled out the marijuana plants and replanted the soil with vineyards, and this has just produced a really credible source of income for the local farmers. It's got everybody far more involved with the villages around that area. Infrastructure is really improving, and it's just really helping the locals there make a credible source of income, and it's actually producing some really, really good wines. That's the Couvent Rouge winery. Now, I mentioned the Batroun Mountains area. Certainly one of my favorite wineries there is called Aurora, and they are, as I mentioned, situated on top of a mountain with views, kind of rolling views all the way down to the sea, olive groves. It's incredibly Mediterranean. If you closed your eyes, you could be in the south of France or somewhere, and the wines they make just exude elegance. Very, very classic wines, tend to use French grapes. So they have Chardonnay, they have Pinot Noir, they have a Bordeaux blend, so Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. They have a Cabernet Franc, which is absolutely delicious as well, and a Sauvignon Blanc as well, which I was quite surprised because Lebanon as I mentioned, is very warm, but they've found the acidity. They've managed to make that really, really good as well. And then you have another winemaker nearby that area who stands out, and that's because he is producing natural wines, and also adopting the biodynamic approach, which is far more intuitive. It kind of allows the grapes to do what they want to do. He's paying attention to what's happening in the soil. There are sun days and flower days. And he again is sort of situated at the top of a mountain overlooking the valley below. Very, very beautiful experience, and very, very expressive wines as well. Now, before you reach the sort of center of the Bekaa Valley, you have to pass through a town called Zahle, often thought to be the capital of the Bekaa Valley, and again, a wine producing region. And there you will find a beautiful winery called Domaine Wardy, with a lovely story behind it. Rose Wardy. Wardy also means flower in Arabic. The grandmother, Rose Wardy, or great grandmother, was married to a fighter who was assassinated, and she ended up bringing her children up on her own as a single mother. She then became the sort of figurehead for the whole village, and a really, really strong woman. And they have a superb range of wines with beautiful stories behind them, also made by a female winemaker, which I love. And very, very expressive. They have single varietals. They use the Obeidi grape particularly. They're very good, putting the Obeidi grape in oak, and very, very lovely examples of wines from Lebanon. Fresh, the reds, the whites, the rosés, really, really good. I can't talk about Lebanon without mentioning Chateau Musar, of course. Iconic wines. We know from the moment he was able to export his wines during the Civil War that this was going to be a winery that really stood out. And the personality, not only of the wines, but of the family, because it's been passed down through generations, has also really stood out. Very, very well known within the Lebanese wine industry is the Musar family and their wines as well. So I've mentioned the grapes are, a lot of them are French, but they are in fact experimenting with their own grapes, and blending wines and other European grapes as well. And I think there is a new wave of winemakers who are really coming in and listening more to the soil and the expressions of Lebanese terroir, rather than trying to replicate what perhaps the French may have wanted, or trying to please the market. They are creating Lebanese wines, and this is what really makes them stand out. And you can find white wines, red wines, rosé wines, and in all different styles as well. But characteristically, I think the reds tend to be spicy. If they're oaked, they are really quite full on and tannic. Having said that, you can find young reds, which are incredibly refreshing in the summer months as well. The whites, the typical blend of Viognier, Muscat and Chardonnay, is now being left to one side a little bit, and people are experimenting with single varietals. And I love the La Turba whites, and I love the Aurora whites. I think the elegance is incredible. And similarly with Domaine Wardy, they have a huge selection of different blends, and they really are picking the best elements from each, all of the grapes, and putting them together to create different sensations within the wine as well. The big co-op is a huge producer of wine, but they also have some excellent top-end Viognier, oaked Viognier, which is stunning. I had a bottle the other day, Racine it's called. Really, really incredible stuff, very unique. So there is so much to discover with Lebanon. Now, I'm sure you'll be aware that last August, on August the 4th, we were hit by a massive explosion that I think is the third largest explosion in the world, and it has made everything more difficult, or even more difficult in Lebanon. Politically, it's never been 100% stable. Even after the 1990 civil war, there was another invasion in 2006, and currently Lebanon is in a huge crisis. So I believe personally that one of the best things to come out of Lebanon are its wines. It is an industry that is so interesting and that has survived over countless invasions, wars, struggles. The economic crisis hasn't been easy for them. Everything has been imported constantly in Lebanon, and this has been really hard for them to get their bottles, corks. So I would suggest, if you are able to go out and try a Lebanese wine, then please do. Not only are they incredibly interesting, but you'll also be supporting a really, really special country. I hope you enjoyed that. Please do reach out for anything you might want to know more, and cheers.